You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 13th of August, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Is recognising Palestine helping or hindering Palestinians? Should the public be encouraged to accost shoplifters? And the backlash against cafe table hoggers. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Latika Burke and Bertu Öschalik will discuss today's big stories, and we'll meet the curator of a new exhibition reflecting on how early radio transformed the lives of its listeners. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Bertu Öschalik, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at RUSI, and Latika Burke, Writer-at-Large for Australian publication The Nightly. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Bertu, last time you were here, you said you were about to go to Jordan. You have now been to Jordan and returned from Jordan. How was it?
It was fantastic for a number of reasons. Of course, primarily, it's very good to be there. Mm-hmm. I was in Amman. Researching, thinking, speaking to colleagues there about Jordan's role in the Middle East and the wider regional developments ongoing. Of course, Jordan now is becoming even more pivotal to conflict de-escalation amidst what's going on in Syria, with Israel and Gaza, of course. So from a foreign policy point of view, Jordan is a very important actor and a partner to the UK.
I mean, we will be turning very shortly to slightly more troubled areas of the Middle East, which is basically almost all of them. But what is your sense of how nervous Jordanians are about that peace and placidity they have managed to cultivate over recent decades? Because it is remarkable for being that Middle Eastern country, and I mean this as the highest of compliments, where very little ever seems to happen.
Yes, absolutely. And the kingdom prides itself on having preserved stability, relative stability, in a very difficult neighborhood for a long time, despite domestic pressures and cross-border ones. I think there is a palpable sense of concern now about what could happen next with respect to potential a push for annexation in Gaza, certainly in the West Bank, which is a long-standing red line for Jordan, and increasing discontent about what's happening in southern Syria, which of course has destabilizing potential for Jordan in terms of smuggling, transnational crime, and instability across the border in its neighbor.
And Latika, last time you were here, you were able to regale us with tales of having visited Kyiv. Next time you are here after this, please stay with the timeline, listeners. You will be able to regale us with tales of Italy, which is where you're about to go.
Yes, that's correct. Tomorrow morning, an early flight. But guess what? This is not for work.
Not for work?
Well, I'm seeing a bunch of work people, but okay. I might not. I mean, there's no conferences to attend. So I'm actually going to probably buy a nice bottle of wine on the way, a good burrata, and enjoy some sunshine.
Which particular bit of Italy are you enjoying?
Tuscany.
That's never a bad idea, though.
It's not. It's really not.
Which bit of Tuscany, if we can ask?
Somewhere near Pisa.
Okay.
I think maybe an hour drive from Pisa. I'm not sure.
Pisa is all right. I've been to Pisa.
Have you seen the Leaning Tower?
I have. No, Latika, I didn't know. I went all the way to Pisa and thought, should we go and take a look?
Incredibly, I have been to Pisa and not seen the Leaning Tower.
How?
Because when I was in Australia, I had to come back for a job. It was to go to Tuscany for 3 nights, stay with Jamie Oliver and 11 other journalists in a villa for some promotion for his new cookbook. He cooked a magnificent feast for us. It did mean, however, I got off my long-haul flight from Sydney, landed at London Heathrow, had to be at Gatwick in about 4 hours and arrive in Tuscany that night, and I was already late. So that's why I did not see the Leaning Tower of Pisa, despite coming through Pisa.
Well, you can rectify that on this trip.
This is my mission.
We look forward to seeing your amusing photo of you standing in the foreground with your hand held up so it looks like
I would never do this, Andrew.
It up.
Don't disgrace me, please.
We will start in Palestine, an increasingly recognised entity. While it is the case that Palestine had long been recognised by most members of the United Nations, Israel's response to Hamas's attack of October 7th, 2023 has prompted something of a scramble aboard the bandwagon, even among those previously reluctant due largely to their support for Israel. In recent weeks especially, France, Australia, the United Kingdom and Canada, among others. Israel has reacted predictably, i.e. by suggesting that this is rewarding terror, and also seems determined to push on with recently telegraphed plans to occupy even more of Gaza. Latika, I'll ask you first because our shared homeland is one of those countries. If we narrow this question down to Australia, is it clear what anybody actually is now recognising when they grandly announce we recognise Palestine?
No, but I don't think that's the point, and I think it is a bit semantic to get split on that, notwithstanding what a big gesture this is. It is very clear that political support internationally has run out for Benjamin Netanyahu and his goals, and that is essentially what this move is about. Very uncomfortably, Hamas has come out and praised this overnight and said that this is absolutely the result of what they did on October 7, and they have achieved some of their aims in this recognition, including by Australia, of Palestine. That is, of course, not helpful. But nevertheless...
And almost certainly not true. I don't think they embarked on that massacre thinking this will get Australia on board.
That's right. And I think this is the start of the beginning of something different in this whole process. I personally don't have a great deal of hope because I don't think the Middle East's problems will be solved in the next 6 months or 12 months, and certainly not by this single gesture. But I think more broadly what this is saying is that we have a very clear cleavage between US leadership on the Middle East, which has always prevailed when it has come to the Allies, and the rest. And you're seeing domestic politics fused with the European left, and I would put Australia into that category here, now taking a very divergent path. And this is, I think, part of the price of what Trump and MAGA are doing. They are ceding some of their political influence and being able to direct and corral allies to do things where they previously might have held their nose and continued on.
Birchu, I think it is definitely the case that for a lot of these Western governments, this recognition is driven by domestic political concerns. This is a way of I guess, quelling a lot of disquiet among the left and centre-left, although Israel's behaviour, I think, has caused that sentiment to spread beyond that part of the spectrum, certainly in recent weeks. But is there a danger that it has, not the intended effect, i.e. that if Benjamin Netanyahu perceives that there is a critical mass towards recognition of Palestine, he starts thinking, I have to roll this up quickly and I have to extinguish any practical chance of this happening, because he has, of course, always been a two-state solution skeptic at best.
Yes, absolutely. Those are excellent points. And it's very difficult to read. But, well, it's both difficult to read and simultaneously easy to predict, I think, what the Netanyahu cabinet's thinking here is in terms of the far-right ministers. Mm-hmm. There is a sense that the occupation plan that was greenlit last week for initially Gaza City, there is a sense that this might be to create leverage over Hamas, that the prospect of the IDF entering Gaza City, the sort of the last major stronghold of Hamas, would put sufficient pressure on Hamas to release the remaining Israeli hostages. For Hamas, of course, the hostages are essential leverage. It's their lifeline. It's their access to what they perceive as legitimacy. And so, on the one hand, we have this scenario where this is an act of leverage. On the other hand, we have the reality that despite his misgivings about the plan to occupy Gaza City, the chief of staff of the IDF today approved an initial plan, an action plan. We don't have the details of what that looks like, but it does seem to, the intention seems to be to go ahead with this, at least maybe in phases or partially on a far delayed timeline that Netanyahu and the far-right ministers may have sought. But it's unclear to what extent this will actually put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages and agree to the terms of a ceasefire. I think in terms of the impact on the ground of Western recognition, the declaration of intent to recognize the state of Palestine and the two-state solution, I think, yes, there is a danger that this slips into becoming a sort of a hollow gesture without material changes inside Gaza. But if we think about what it's saying, and part of that is that this is the Palestinian homeland. The borders of that are unclear, but in terms of the renunciation of the forceful expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza, whether we call that the Trump Riviera plan or any other plan by the Netanyahu government, I think the UK, France, Australia, their statement of the existence of Palestine, at least, let's say, in this instance, is equivalent to saying the Palestinians cannot be forced out. This is the homeland. We recognize this. And finally, if I could, I know we are very rightly focusing on Western recognition of Palestine. At the same time, the Arab League and others, including Turkey, called upon Hamas, again, recently, to lay down arms, to disarm, and to hand over political governing authority to a transitional administration and ultimately the Palestinian Authority, which is recognized as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people.
Yes, and I want to pick up on that point because ultimately it's only really Qatar and some of those Arab states that can have the influence over Hamas. And I think we're reading this, or at least critics of Western government's decision to announce they're recognising a Palestine are reading this slightly incorrectly. The intended audience here is not Hamas. In some ways, it's actually not even about Gazans and Palestinians. This is a direct message to Donald Trump and to Benjamin Netanyahu saying, we have had enough. We're out. We're no longer with you. And I think when you read the messaging like that and then you go and explore some of the very strong comments, actually, that some of these leaders who are normally very mild-mannered and don't get involved in foreign policy conflicts at all, let alone on the Middle East. Anthony Albanese, for example, has said that Benjamin Netanyahu is, quote, in denial. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon of New Zealand has said that Benjamin Netanyahu has lost the plot. This is less about Hamas, more about saying to Netanyahu, to the government of Israel and to the White House, the time is up.
Well, let's stay in the vicinity, but somewhat north, i.e. Lebanon, into which Iran still appears keen to insert its oar, despite the recent decapitation of its local proxy Hezbollah by Israeli military action and espionage, and clear signals by Lebanon's own government to the effect that they intend to run Hezbollah's military wing out of business. The Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Larijani, has been visiting Lebanon and appears to have been treated to a series of meetings without coffee. Lebanon's president, Joseph Aoun, has told him that Lebanon would prefer a stretch of being left alone to sort itself out, or words to that effect. Bertru, how much did you enjoy Larijani saying that Iran does not interfere in Lebanon's internal affairs?
Yes, the acts of twisting the truth or cynicism. No, it's fascinating, but it does, of course, it's consistent. It aligns with Iranian gesturing that the resistance, however defined, but across the Middle East, Iran supported armed non-state actors, proxy, militia, however we define these categories. The Iranian point of view is that they have taken on sort of an energy of their own. The resistance survives in their own right, in places like Lebanon, in Gaza, in Iraq, in Yemen via the Houthis. So that's one part of the argument. Lebanon has condemned what it sees as a violation of its sovereignty, of its domestic affairs when it comes to Iranian or any other meddling in the decision to disarm Hezbollah. Disarmament is a very challenging task, whether it's in Lebanon or elsewhere in the world. What's interesting now is that, of course, we can speak about the case of Hezbollah more directly. But when we zoom out slightly, there is a process of DDR or disarmament, demilitarization, reintegration going on with respect to many of these armed non-state actors. So if you look to Iraq, there's currently debate in Parliament, in the political sphere, about what to do with the pro-Iran militia that was originally founded in the fight to defeat ISIS or Daesh, the Popular Mobilization Units. So that is one part of the puzzle. We have, of course, Hamas and the potential to how to disarm Hamas, to what extent that's possible. Interestingly, we have the process underway in Turkey and northern Syria and Iraq with respect to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and we have Hezbollah. And these are very challenging issues locally, nationally, transnationally, but it's important to, I think, see how they are connected and the bigger story that it tells about whether we're now in an age post 7th of October, then this realignment in the Middle East that we're talking about, whether this spells the end of armed non-state actors or whether this is the beginning of the revolution towards entrenchment within these states, state capture, various, again, ways to conceptualize this. But yes, very challenging in the context of Hezbollah and the plan to disarm in the coming weeks and months.
Latika, Hezbollah are putting up quite a bluff here. Their line is basically, you want our guns, come and get them, which is obviously daring Lebanon's government to, embark upon yet another Lebanese civil war. Hezbollah calculating that both Lebanon's government and everybody else, given the choice between allowing an armed Hezbollah to exist and another Lebanese civil war, will take the former.
I think this is a big question for the United States. It clearly does not want to get involved in another forever war in the Middle East. It has really withdrawn from the region. Who can forget Jake Sullivan's infamous comment before October 7 that the region had never been quieter? That is the status quo they would ideally like and prefer to see. And so it's a question now of they have let Netanyahu run rampant for several years. One of the biggest crowning achievements of Israel and Netanyahu's plan has been the weakening of Iran and her proxies, particularly the spectacular success in neighbouring Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And that is something that Netanyahu will always have alongside his legacy. But what does finish the job mean? We are told that Trump has told Bibi, finish the job in Gaza, and then what? What is the regional redrawing we see? And how does what happens in Gaza affect how the rest of the region then responds to Israel and this reordering of the region? I think the US, whether it likes it or not, will see itself being a presence in the Middle East.
In practical terms then, Birchu, just finally on that, but picking up on that, it does appear clear that if Hezbollah are going to be disarmed, as the Lebanese government says will happen by the end of this year, then somebody is going to have to disarm them. There is a UN Security Council resolution 1701 calling for exactly that, but it's one thing to pass a resolution, another to enforce it. There is a UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, as there has been for many decades, though as I understand their mandate, they are not enjoined to take the fight up to Hezbollah and take all their kit off them. So if the Lebanese military isn't capable in itself of defeating Hezbollah in battle, and I haven't read an analysis by anybody who thinks it is, who is going to make Hezbollah do this?
Well, it's very unclear. And the question certainly is about removing light weapons in the first instance and then moving up to weapon production facilities that would be removed. There's a sort of a three-phased plan, a U.S.-designed plan for 60, 90, 120-day milestones up until the end of this year. Again, here, what we're up against is the sequencing issue, in that there's those in Lebanon who want Israel to commit to withdrawing fully from the positions that they've occupied since the ceasefire in southern Lebanon, first, before Hezbollah disarms. And of course, the U.S. and Israel position is that Hezbollah commits to disarming, and the Lebanese armed forces demonstrate its ability to do so before Israel moves out. Otherwise, Israel will continue to be under sort of existential pressure from southern Lebanon and the future of Hezbollah. But disarmament aside for one moment, of course, Hezbollah has a long-standing entrenched status in Lebanon. It is often dubbed the state within a state. It has deep pockets of popular support. The very reason for its origins and its rise, its sort of sprawling network, is because it was able to deliver services in social welfare and hospitals and schooling that the Lebanese state was not able to do. And so now the question is the Lebanese state itself, beyond the question of disarmament, will it be able to create sort of governance structures within southern Lebanon and to unify the country fully? And that is the big unknown at the moment.
Well, to the United Kingdom now, and the exciting suggestion that police duties should be outsourced to the public. The Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner, to be clear, despite what might be suggested by the job title, he's against it, has enjoined the general public to stand up to shoplifters rather than relying on the police. Pause for mirthless laughter from British listeners, well aware that one might as well report crimes to Santa Claus. It follows recent capital D discourse attached to shoplifting, much of it prompted by the fact that one shopkeeper in Wales had managed to get local police to attend, to warn him that someone had taken exception to a sign he'd put up describing shoplifters as scumbags. Latika, the numbers in London in particular suggest that shoplifting is up 54% in a year versus 15% nationwide, and those are, of course, only the ones anybody bothers to report. But is it amplified even beyond that by social media? Because it occurs to me, researching this today, if 30 years ago somebody had pinched a handful of sandwiches from a Sainsbury's in Brockley, I would not have known about that, whereas now I do.
Oh, that's possible. Although, I mean, I moved here nearly 10 years ago and I don't remember crime being talked about the way it is now. Every single day. And I live on a very busy street, southeast London, central London, and it has been a hot topic, I would say, for at least the last 2 years, and very strongly. There's a couple of businesses I go into very often, and they have set up WhatsApp groups coordinating between, I mean, the guy opposite me who runs a plant shop has just had people come in, pick up a plant and take it down the road to the outdoor market, and he has gone down and caught them reselling it and taken the plant out of their hands and put it back in his own shop. I mean, this is really happening. And I don't remember these sorts of conversations when I first moved here. I do think it's a real problem, and I don't think it's exaggerated, and I do think that citizens are taking it into their own hands. Where I live, we've had our own neighbourhood performing, my own residents, neighbours performing citizens' arrests from people coming and stealing our parcels. I don't really advise this. I think it's a really dangerous, hairy situation, because a lot of these people who are involved in this level of petty theft are usually doing some very hard drugs. They're homeless. They've got mental illness problems. There's a lot of associated problems. So I really am very troubled to hear the police say, hey, the public, you need to step up, when really crime and law and order are policing issues and they're government issues. And if they have been allowed to become rampant and out of control, which they are, in my view, that is not for the public to put themselves in harm's way here.
Ideally not, because there is, I think, it's worth pointing out a knock-on detriment to this beyond the crime itself, Birchu. I mean, where I live, for example, one local, like our local Sainsbury's has recently refitted, so there's now glass barriers between yourself and the staff, who I suspect are actually quite reasonably frightened by, and then they're not paid enough to actually have to risk physical injury to prevent somebody nicking stuff from the shop. In other stores, there are sort of security tags on individual bottles of alcohol. We haven't quite got to the point where I live on such things on steak and or blocks of cheese, but they are reliably reported elsewhere in London, and that does not make you feel necessarily happy about where you're living. Yes,
that's right. And there are various surveillance technologies and cameras, and there's sort of this tech approach, which I think carries a different set of problems in terms of, being watched unnecessarily by the state, and sort of CCTV-related sort of risks and concerns that we've had from a civil liberties point of view. But I think part of this debate or this concern also we have to address the drivers of this type of crime. What is what is driving this uptick in theft, this shoplifting epidemic, as it's been called. I think there's also been some very good reporting about the rise in poverty in the United Kingdom, how this links to the rise in crime. Of course, these are well-known, well-versed debates from a sociological point of view as well as criminology. But the high cost of living, particularly post COVID, I think is important. The rise in poverty across London and other parts of the UK. So being able to address those from a policy point of view, those issues from a policy point of view, and tackle the root causes of crime, I think is more challenging, because not the easier, but I suppose the low-hanging fruit approach is to install cameras and to sort of watch those committing theft. But I think the wider issue is the robustness, the resilience of the safety net in the UK, and the ways in which to tackle poverty and homelessness and find more sustainable long-term solutions.
I do think part of it's societal, though. I mean, there's plenty of capital cities I've been into, I could say, in the last 2-3 years. Japan, Tokyo, one, or any city in Japan, really. Taiwan was another one. Taipei was very safe. Even when I was in Kyiv, everyone says you don't get things stolen from you here. You can put your phone down, and if you left it, you would get it back. I was in a group in Japan, and a girl there lost her wallet and her passport, got it back within 8 hours intact, everything. That would not happen to you in London.
I mean, is it arguable then, Latika, because on the subject of phones, 80,000 of those stolen in London last year, almost none of them recovered. We have arrived at the point at which one electronics store has put some purple tape on a section of Oxford Street with "Mind the Grab" written on it. This, incredibly, to my mind at least, has been done in cooperation with the Metropolitan Police. Is it arguable that a driver of crime is also people's belief that they can get away with it?
Well, they are getting away with it. It's not even a belief. I have had, just last week, a friend from Australia here rang. I wake up to several deleted messages on WhatsApp and some panicked Instagram messages saying, "I've been robbed. My phone and my wallet. I have nothing. Can you help me?" No, it is out of control. It is absolutely out of control. I think we all know everyone who's had their phone snatched out of their hands in London. And it is despite there being software in these devices that can track and trace, police can't go and trace or don't have the warrants or the power to actually go into properties and extract those phones back. So yes, it's a problem because people get away with it, and it's obviously a highly lucrative market. I think we need to be moving to a provenance kind of resale marketplace where people have to prove how they obtained devices and bikes and things if they want to resell, and it should be put on secondhand shops to make sure very clearly that they know that that item that they're reselling was not stolen.
I think if I could just add, what's really interesting is that in these phones, particularly these gadgets, that they end up in parts of China very quickly. So this is beyond sort of petty theft or sort of individual
organized
issues. It's organized transnational crime networks that are behind this.
And Albania, I think we've seen a lot of them turn up in Albania.
Well, we will move on to a lesser infraction, to South Korea, where the local franchise of one well-known purveyor of vaguely coffee-flavoured lukewarm drinks has declared a hard line on patrons who treat their cafes like a co-working space. It has been reported that people were not only hogging tables for ages while sipping interminably at a single vaguely coffee-flavoured lukewarm drink, but setting up equipment including but not limited to desktop computers, printers and partitions. Putative customers have now been told that they can bring laptops, tablets and phones, but no more. Disappointingly, there does not seem to have been a threat to taser anyone who plays audio out loud on them shortly before punting them onto the footpath, cartoon boot print visible in seat of trousers. We will start with confessions. Birchu, first of all, have you ever been guilty of this? I will confess to having written quite a lot of one book in the very agreeable surroundings of the upstairs cafe of the Tate Modern Museum with a view over the river, because I calculated that if you got in there when it opened at about 10 o'clock in the morning, there was nobody else there. There was no music. And once I sort of reached an agreement with the staff that, look, if I sit here for a couple of 2 or 3 hours and we call that 3 or 4 cappuccinos, are we good? And they were like, sure, fine, there's no one else here, knock yourself out. But I contend that I was doing my bit there. I wasn't just ordering an espresso and taking up an entire morning. My conscience, I think, is clear.
That's very good. You know what? I think mine is as well. I mean, I was a poor PhD student for for quite a long time, so I am guilty of spending more time than I probably should have in coffee shops. But I would buy lattes or Americanos when, at a reasonable pace, I think, to justify my presence there. But reading this story in South Korea, I mean, the commitment of some customers bringing in partitions and printers.
It was the printer that actually turned me quite giddy. That's amazing.
Why stop there? I mean, why not bring your gaming chair? Why not bring several screens? I mean, you could go all out.
What is the worst of this sort you have seen?
Oh, no, I actually haven't seen this, to be honest. And I must admit, I'm a bit of an offender because I travel for work so much. I'm not immune at all to taking my laptop to a bar or sitting at a bar and doing work or anything like that. But most people don't mind. And I'm fairly chatty, so I can put it away if I get talking to someone. But taking the printer in really did me over for this story, I must admit.
I mean, it's not quite the same thing, and I may have mentioned it from behind this microphone before, but I am still agog when I think back to a restaurant I went to in Washington, D.C. Last year, and I was sitting with friends in one particular booth. 2 people sat down in the booth adjacent to us, took out their phone, propped it up against the wall where they could both watch it and put a film on.
Oh, so I was at a 3-star Michelin Japanese once, and it's one of those ones where there's only like 7 people at the bar and the master is serving you, literally feeding you in your mouth sometimes. And it was a World Cup final in which England was playing. And no joke, one of the diners set up their iPhone with a live stream of the football. And I have never seen a sushi master so deeply unimpressed.
The sushi master's got a lot of sharp implements as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
he didn't say a word in typical Japanese style, but he was deeply, deeply unimpressed.
I mean, where is the balance, Bertrude? Because on the one hand, a cafe is a public space and it is supposed to be hospitable to people, but they are entitled at some point, are they not, to just take the line that we are actually a business, we are trying to turn a profit, and you, sir or madam, are taking the piss.
Yes. Well, I think, because the customer's always right, a mentality should prevail up until a point. There is sort of a sense of reasonableness there. And whether you call it poor manners or not, or it's partly, I suppose, driven by the rise of the gig economy and that people are increasingly working for themselves or working from home, and lockdown has meant that people have that experience of, I think, being so constrained, have wanted these other spaces, third spaces, to be able to spend their time. But at the end of the day, these are commercial entities, they're businesses, and so if there's a strain on their resources, electricity to keep that printer buzzing, then I think, that it's reasonable to put some restrictions on it. And to be fair, the corporation in question, I think the franchise in South Korea did say that they could bring iPhones and iPads and laptops. Just, the principle of reasonableness, I think, there should prevail.
Oh, is there just finally, Latika, an argument for unreasonableness on this? Because not that I'm suggesting they're unreasonable, but I will say that in Monocle's excellent cafes in London, Paris, Zurich and elsewhere, discreet signs suggest that you keep your laptop stashed, that this is that this is a social environment.
Oh, that's really interesting. Look, I don't actually like that, because being someone who is constantly on the move, and my office is very often in my handbag, and I need to file very close to deadlines sometimes. A desk in a coffee shop or a bar and a nice drink is absolute salvation for me. So I'd hate to see people turned away from that. But I was going to say, don't forget J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter because she was so poor she could not afford heating, and she wrote that in a cafe. And I think there is something truly romantic about that. So I hope we don't throw it all out. Printers can stay at home for sure. But I really hope we never get to an environment where writers can't be writing in public.
Latika Burke and Bertu Ursulek, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, radio is by now a familiar companion, but it was once the disruptive new technology. As the first ever form of home-based mass entertainment, it changed lives. Histories of radio tend to focus on the broadcasters, but one exhibition in Oxford is dedicated to telling the stories of the people who experienced this massive cultural shift. Monocle's Mariella Bevan spoke to Beatty Rubens, the curator of Listen In, How Radio Changed the Home, to find out more.
Now we're taking you over to St Hilary, Cornwall for the first broadcast of the Nativity play.
I'm an artist myself. Do you do anything in the nude? I have a bath every Friday.
When it first emerged, they were a bit baffled by it, and they were anxious whether it was for them or whether it was just for rich people. Some people even wondered where it was going to happen. There was an idea that it might happen a bit like going to the pictures, that you would go somewhere and sit and listen. So there were lots of misunderstandings about quite what it would be, but it was very heavily promoted, both by the BBC, which had just opened, and the radio manufacturers. And surprisingly quickly, in about 2 or 3 years, suddenly really the whole country was talking about radio. And even if you'd decided, as a few people did, that you didn't want to buy into radio, you couldn't avoid it. It was everywhere. There were songs about it and advertisements about it. It was just the thing that everybody was talking about.
Radio not only drastically changed home entertainment, but for some people it even changed how they designed their homes. Could you talk a little bit about how radio impacted home decor and design?
I think to begin with, it was much more a case of how are we going to fit in this rather kind of scientific gadget into our late Victorian or early Edwardian home. By the 1930s, when you begin to get a much more slimline Art Deco kind of aesthetic, what you then get is people not so much trying to fit the radio into their homes, but actually designing their homes so that they could integrate a radio. And there are actually cases you can find in newspapers of people saying, yes, I redesigned my home with this kind of very sleek furniture, for example, because I wanted to fit in my beautiful, sleek, modern designed radio. So that's an absolute transformation between 1922 and 1939.
Radio Luxembourg began broadcasting in 1933. What does the popularity of stations like Radio Luxembourg tell us about the cross-border flow of culture in the 1930s? And how did international broadcasting shape listeners' sense of identity?
The main thing that the commercial networks broadcast was music, popular music, lighter music, what was called variety, which was a mixture of kind of music and entertainment, comedy and so on. And it broadcast those because it's what people wanted to listen to. Listeners stopped listening and moved over to Luxembourg, in particular in Normandy, in their millions. And the BBC suddenly realised that that was a serious threat. So it's absolutely true that this form of quite celebrity-led, light entertainment had its attraction across Europe. But as war approached, it also became clear that radio could be a really dangerous form of technology. Hitler and Mussolini used radio and monopolized radio in a way that meant that their message alone could be carried to their nations, to disastrous effects, of course, as we know. And at that moment, I think the idea that you might turn to radio for entertainment, but also for serious and truthful news and current affairs becomes very, very powerful again. And certainly by 1939 and the outbreak of war, British listeners are listening in particular to the 9 o'clock news almost like a religious observance. People leave the streets to go in and listen to the news. And in any case, when war broke out, because the military suggested it needed all of the signals, actually Normandy and Luxembourg were closed down, so they didn't even continue to broadcast from the beginning of the war.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received. and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The Trump administration is targeting platforms like Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe. You know, these are platforms that allow people in countries with limited press freedom to hear unbiased news. Given radio's historic role in bringing the news and information to people on a broad scale, how does this history help us understand the significance of platforms like Radio Free Europe and the impact of cutting their funding today?
It emphasises again and again and again how important radio is, that it's a very cheap and easy medium, and that it will bring truthful stories into people's lives. And again, when I've shown, in particular, elderly people around the exhibition, I've heard stories of the importance, particularly during critical political times and wartime, of radio. So that's not just British people listening to the BBC and the stories it's trying to tell as truthfully as possible. I showed around an elderly French woman who said that in her childhood in occupied Paris, secretly her parents would go every evening into another room and listen to the BBC because it knew that it was going to get truthful news that way. And that image of this young, as she was then, this young child being aware that her parents were finding out really what was happening by listening to the radio, I think gives you an idea of just how important that is today, and what the defunding of these networks tells us about the way that certain governments are trying to limit our access to what is really going on.
We are not going to stop broadcasting. Broadcasting has come to stay.
That was Monocle's Mariella Bevan speaking to the curator of the exhibition Listen In, How Radio Changed the Home, which is open at the Western Library in Oxford until the 31st of August. Beatty Rubin's accompanying book of the same name is also available now. That is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Birchu Urshulik and Latika Burke. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.